Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our interview. I hope that we're going to all learn something. When I've had conversations with Salvo in the past, I've always come away enlightened and informed and plenty of food for thought afterwards. So I hope that we have the same. Um, thanks, Naya, for explaining the thing at the very beginning. I wanted to explain to you why we wanted to do this project in the first place, in the sense that I wanted us to have a pan-European project to look at succession planning and family business, because family business is important. We lose about 600,000 businesses each and every year, EU, UK wide, due to lack of succession planning. The vast majority are family businesses. And I think that we need to address this. And the opportunity, there is a threat, obviously, because we're losing all these businesses. Probably we could even double that through the pandemic, but there is a great opportunity to try and save. We're thinking 20%. Salva and I've talked about this, 20% of family businesses, 100,000 family businesses through succession planning. So the purpose of our discussion today is to look at the topic and to look at key issues on that topic. There are two key issues that I want us to look at. The first one is strategy and how it's important as a context for succession planning. And the second one, equally important, governance, and how governance works within family business and how it protects family businesses through the generations. So I'm going to introduce Salvatore Tomaselli. He is a professor of business school in Palermo. He is a globetrotter in family business. He is a consultant for family business worldwide. And also he sits on the board of several major family business companies. And so Salva's got a depth of knowledge, and I enjoy talking to him because he has this depth and because he has insights and he contemplates the topic, and I always come away feeling enriched. And I'm glad to say that he considers himself my friend, which is always nice to know. So my first question then, Salvo, is when we talk about strategy, why is it important for the owner, manager, and the leader of a family business to have a strategy? Why should it be important to have a strategy, particularly in the context of post-pandemic?
Well, we can thank you, Peter, first of all, for your introduction, and thank you to all the participants. And going to your question, we can use a metaphor of sailing. And when you are sailing in calm waters with the land in your sight, you really do not need to do too much to plan your trajectory, to plan your route. But when things becomes troubled, when you lose the sight to the land, or when you are in a storm, then you really need to have a plot of your route, and knowing when you design the plot that you will probably never be exactly aligned, but that allows you to make the point and to check where you are in respect to where you need to be in a certain moment, and then you can make adjustments. You can eventually even change or adjust your goals, your objectives, but you need to have control of the boat. So the metaphor works also for businesses, because when the business is small and local, you don't need to have too much in your toolbox for doing your strategy. But when the business becomes more complex, and any business becomes more complex in the transition from one generation to another at whatever level, and when things becomes more complex in the environment, because so you face it has happened over the last decades, more and more competitive pressure, more and more innovation in technologies, more and more competition at an international level, then you need to understand better where you want to go and why you want to go there, and how you can reach the goals you want to.
Okay, and I think an additional thing to that I found in practice is that if we have a strategy that's written down, everybody can contribute. If it's in somebody's head, then we can't contribute. So when we talk about, you and I have talked in the past about having a vision, a family business having a vision, and you use the term destiny, and you say that a
Yeah.
vision gives inspiration, and it's important for every company to have a destiny. So we've got this very interesting slide up, Salvo. Can you explain what you mean by destiny, please?
Yeah, the word destiny has the same root as the word destination. And the destiny is anyhow, in whatever circumstance, is your final destination, is the place where you will reach anyhow. The point is whether you want your desired destination coincide with your destiny, or you want to reach your destiny by faith. And when you have a family in business, when you have multiple family members sharing the ownership and sharing the workplace in a family business, you need to have a shared vision, shared goals, and shared awareness. And the three pictures tries to give an example of what can happen when family business members are not aware about the business. Each one of them will have their own personal idea of what the business is, and not necessarily any of them will coincide with reality. And the second picture shows what happens when goals are not shared. Each one will compete to take the business for his or her own sake. And the lack of shared vision will create a discussion in which each of the participants in the discussion, that is an example of a boardroom, for instance, and each one is discussing having something in the back of his or her mind that is not declared, but is not possibly compatible with the business strategy or with the needs for the business, what is needed for the advancement of the business strategy. And at the very end, we have to understand that the business to a family is a tool to reach certain family goals, individual goals and family goals. So to have respect for the tool and to allow the tool to make properly its job is also beneficial for the family.
Thank you, Salvo. I think that we've all had situations in business where, well, we've all had situations in meetings actually when we've left the meeting and we've thought we've all agreed on something, when in actual fact, we've all taken something differently away. And I love the illustration of the elephant, because I think that the danger is that we'll touch the elephant and we won't know which part we're touching, and we will not share the vision. And as a result, we're not all working towards the same goal. So that's pretty profound. I think that we've all had a terrible shock in the pandemic as a result of where the lockdowns and has become the recession. And quite frankly, as we've said, it's like fighting a war with borrowed money. So every government is decided to spend money, quite rightly, to keep the economy going. But in the context of our family business, can you explain the difference between having a short-term strategy and a long-term strategy, and how they fit together and why they're essential?
Yeah, well, as you're mentioning, the pandemic has obliged people to, I mean business owners, business managers, to concentrate on a number of very short-term emergencies. Social distancing has caused consequences in many businesses. Cash flow has created other more additional troubles. The supply chain has been interrupted in the first moment, and then has had many changes later on. It continues to change frequently. Employees' health has become an issue in many circumstances. We are going continuously from one lockdown to the following one, and senior management has been exposed to unexpected vulnerability. All these issues tends to catch the attention of the management in whatever business. Now, the difference between businesses which are able to survive the pandemic and be prepared for the after pandemic, and those which are not, is that those who will have more difficulties in recovering post the pandemic are those who only concentrate on the short term. For sure, the short term is what we need, it is what catches our attention and effort to survive the pandemic. But if you don't have an idea of what will happen later on, and you don't get prepared for the subsequent moments, then after the survival, you will find a decline anyhow. So you need to have a sort of strategic strabismus in which, while you take care of the short term, you look at the long term, you focus on the long term, to the all those elements that have been accelerated by the pandemic. Think about the technology, think about the changes in industries, think about the huge discussion at the international level and the change in the globalization models we are going to face in the next years. Or think about topics like the climatic change, and other pandemics that can arise. We know that the World Health Organization is launching continuously new alarms about what can happen in the future in this respect. Also, many governments, as you were mentioning, are investing hugely to recover from the pandemic and to protect people from the pandemic and the economy. And obviously, they will need to recover from that. And we all know that probably taxation will either increase or make any changes in the future. So you need to have a sort of a radar to detect which of those elements are relevant for your business and how. How will your business will be affected by those elements? And how can you prepare your business to react effectively to the impact of those elements? You know, a few weeks ago, I was having a discussion with the current CEO of a very old family business in the shipping industry. They have been shipping since the times in which Italy was divided in the marinal republics, in the sea republics. And they've continuously been navigating since then. And he was telling me, you know, until a few decades ago, it were we, the boats, who brought pandemics around the world. But we were sailing, and the world was completely different at that time, because when one boat was approaching the land, you have a couple of days of time to be prepared before the ship brought to the land. And it meant that you could understand whether it brought opportunities or threats. You could prepare for catching opportunity or for defending from the threats. And nowadays, it happens very quickly. In 7 hours, the pandemic has spread from China to Europe and from Europe to other, in a few days, to the rest of the world. And it creates conditions that makes necessary to have the radar. And whatever business, even a small one, needs in somehow to build its own radar to understand how those elements will impact your industry and your business and the behavior of your customers, etc., in the next future.
Okay. And when you say radar, you mean radar, don't you? As far as
yes, sorry for the pronunciation.
No, it's all right. You can speak language 20 times better than I am, including English. So you can look over the horizon with the radar, and you can see the future. And I think there's always a contrast between what's urgent and what's important. And the challenge of leadership is to address what is urgent, and at the same time take time out I say to board meetings sometimes, there's a train coming on, we're on the tracks. We need to look into the future and see what that is. And the opportunity, the threats and the opportunities in the future is the role of leadership. So I think that's important. And we will, in my session next week, all be well, discussing the strategy ladders. So what I would like to do now is to ask you to do a little self-assessment on your business. Can we bring that up, Naya, please? Now, we're going to do 2 self-assessments in this session. Salvo and I have constructed a handbook for leadership for succession in family business, and it's a journey to take leaders of family businesses through the process of creating their own succession strategy. As part of that, we need to look at the foundations of where you think you are now. So we would like you to do a self-assessment, and Naya will explain how you can do that and do the voting. But let me go through the questions first of all. Let me also say that, like every self-assessment, I would like you to be thoughtful and objective about what the situation is really like in your company, in the sense that it says here, if we strongly agree that the company has got all of these things, then we put in a 4. If we strongly disagree, it hasn't got any of these things, we put in a 0, or in between that, 1, 2, or 3. The first question is, the family board and senior management team have collectively agreed on a focused vision of what the business will look like in the future. First point, okay? We have designed a clear strategy ladder, and we'll explain the ladder next week, which is the process of getting from where we are now to where we're going to be, how we will implement the strategy of pivotal objectives that need to be achieved to reach our vision over a specified time frame. You have 5 questions. Each question has a yin and a yang. In other words, there's 2 parts to it. What I would like you to do individually now is to think about this, how it relates to your business. And then I'd like you to score it. Naya, can you show how to score it, please?
Yes, okay. So if you can all go either to www.menti.com and enter this code, or simply you can click on this, on this link, which I think the easiest thing for me to do is to share this link with you in the chat. So give me a minute.
What we're going to do then is we're going to look at the scoring collectively and see what us as a team think are the important issues within our enterprises as we go through. So I'm going to let you have 5 or so minutes to think about that, to read them and to score them. No, we will not know, incidentally, who scored what. So you can, I'd like you to be as honest as possible. So just let you get on with that.
So I've shared the link to the self-assessment in the chat. So you can just click on it. And then I'm going to start the countdown.
Right, okay.
I'll give you 5 minutes. I believe you can all see my screen. So
Yeah,
we can
see it.
look at the results all together in real time.
Okay, I presume these are dynamic and will move, will they, Naya?
Yes, they will move as more people vote.
Okay, cool. That's good. Excellent. All right. Whilst some of you are doing that, I can also say that I've used this tool for a long time, for many years, and it's quite interesting what owners of businesses score. And then later on, when the management team and the next generation is involved, what they score and the contrast between the two. Will we know if everybody's scored, Naya?
Sorry, Peter?
Oh, we're coming on here. Yeah.
Well, the
tell
average.
me if you think everybody's scored, Naya, and then I'll carry on.
Okay, the average keeps moving, so let's wait. And if anyone is having trouble with accessing, just let me know via chat. I can help you out.
Ah. Oh, that's good. Right. I don't know. You can't tell how many people got left to vote, Naya?
No, I can't tell, but I
Okay.
can see if the average is moving. We can give them more, half a minute more.
Yeah, I think that's pretty good. We're getting an impression. Yeah, I'll take a photograph of that. Okay. Okay, so we've got scores on that, which we've got, what have we got? 3.2, 2.8, 3.8, 3.5, 3.7. These are very high scores, actually, as an average score. And they would show to me that most people think that they've got a strategy on board and that people have committed to them and that people are involved. The strategy's been deployed. We've got a 2.9 on that, and that's quite high as well. Everybody's committed to the future of the company. That's also high. Then we've got a high score in terms of short and long term as well. And people have got a record of inspirational leadership. Now, if we are looking at the gap between these scores and the end, we can see that there's a little bit of way to go in terms of the first domain, which is strategy and deployment. And then we see the management team are involved and delegated and whether it's actually happening. We look like we've got a good commitment from family and successors, which is always good. And people are focused on the short term and the long term. That's okay. But and we've got a good record of inspirational leadership from successors. Now, I will say something before I go on. I've alluded to it already, and I would say that on these assessments, when I've done this with owner managers and family businesses and the senior people, the scores have been relatively high. But when I've done the same thing in a separate room with the successors, the scores have been more or less low. They are in the areas of 1 through 2 through 2.5. So take of that what you will, but there is an issue here about our perceptions as leaders of family businesses where we are now. Right, okay, Naya, that's great. Have any of you got any questions you'd like to ask Salvo for the moment with regard to strategy? Has anybody got any questions they would like to ask before we go on to governance? Don't all speak at once.
You can also write in the chat.
You can also write in the chat if you want to. Yeah. Can I'll just fill in then by saying to Salvo that in family businesses, do you generally find in the businesses that you work with that family businesses as a rule have a written strategy and have it deployed to everybody, including successors?
There are many differences among family businesses in this respect. And obviously those who cause advisors like me tends to have a written strategy, but I've entered in family businesses in many different situations and conditions. I've entered in family businesses where no strategic planning process was in place, and I helped them in putting the process in place. Or I have entered in family businesses that already had made the exercise of entering in the strategic planning process, and they needed to improve either on the family side or in the business side or in the communication between the two sides of the coin. And but I can tell you one very interesting story about a family business as I was in touch for a few years. The relationship with these with one member of this family business started the day Donald Trump was elected to the presidency of the United States. I was in Myanmar giving a webinar, a seminar there for the World Bank, for IFC, the World, which is a company of the World Bank devoted to private companies. And we were giving seminars around Southeast Asia on this topic. And the topic of the day was exactly succession and the strategy for succession. And in the first row, there was a man around 65 years with his children surrounding him, 5 children, 1 female and 4 males. And they were sitting in the first row and they were listening all the day. And this man was taking notes of whatever I was mentioning, etc. They were participating in the discussion of the cases. At the end of the day, this man approached me and he told me, "Oh, Professor, thank you for your seminar. I learned a lot, and I can assure you that one day in my family business, we will speak about succession if I die." He didn't tell when I die. He told if I die. And this is a perspective of eternity that is mentioned also in many books of founders, especially of family businesses. Well, I didn't met this person ever in my life, but I remained in touch with his daughter, who from time to time has written me some email. And I received her last email in November. She was announcing me that after 4 weeks of fighting against COVID, his father has gone to death. And he told me that the family is in a sort of a despair because since our seminar, nothing has been done in the family and in the business to be prepared for succession, even though all the 5 children do work in the family business. Nominatively, they are appointed as in management position, but really, this man was the only one who had his strategy in mind. And now they have discovered something they didn't know, that, for instance, his father had raised debt to overcome the 2008 crisis. And the company and even the family wealth are at risk in the present moment. And they're fighting one another between the brothers and between the siblings because they have different views. And this is the first time they can say some word about the future of the family business. And unfortunately, this situation, which is very sad, is not unique. This is what happens in a number of family business, and this is at the root of a number of those cases you have mentioned of family businesses not surviving over time. And so my answer here is it is not usual that family businesses, at least the smaller one, have a written strategy or policy, but this is also not usual that they have an agreed strategy or policy, independent of the fact that they write it or not. Obviously, writing helps because it fixes ideas, it fixes the moment in which you're preparing that specific strategy, and it allows you to come back to that ideas and change them over time and upgrade them over time. But the most important exercise, as many experts in family business says, more than doing the exercise of writing, is doing the exercise of sharing, is doing the exercise of speaking and communicating.
I noticed that we've got quite a
Yes.
few questions that have come out now, haven't we? And I think they're really good. And I think that there's one, there are several questions here, but one of the questions relates to when we talk about strategy, I mean, we need to be clear. Are we talking about the strategy for the business or the strategy for succession, or how do they relate? So can you explain what you mean by, are we talking about the strategy for the business and then succession, or how do they relate?
Well, they are, in my opinion, they are two sides of a single coin. Because obviously it doesn't make any sense to have a strategy for succession if you don't know where the business is going to be in the future. And on the other hand, if you have a good strategy, but you're not prepared for succeeding in leading the company in accomplishing with this strategy, that your strategy exercise is vanishing. So you need both at a certain moment of the business. And you need a business strategy because that gives you the direction. This gives you the way to your destiny, to your destination in the future. But being prepared for succession is to prevent the business from problems in the event that sooner or later will happen. It's not a matter of if, but it's a matter of when. The man in command or the group in command, we have to pass on the baton. And the best thing you can do is that you prepare your successor or your team of successors, and you prepare in my opinion, the first step in the strategy for succession is not preparing successors, it's preparing yourself as the current owner manager for being succeeded. Because the main obstacles to succession I have frequently met in businesses, more than the incompetency of the successor, is the unpreparedness of the succeedee. And sometimes even the incompetence of the successor is the consequence of the unpreparedness of the succeedee.
That's interesting. I mean, it's those are quite harsh words, but they're quite interesting in the sense that next week, when you're interviewing me, we'll be talking about the third leadership challenge of succession, which is exactly that, for leaders to prepare for succession. I think to answer the question again, relating to the redirect question, is that you're saying that the strategy for the business is vital for the business, and the strategy for the business is the context within which we have succession. In other words, it's the opportunity for which we can understand our roles and actually develop successes in that context. I mean, we have comments here about the problem, the clarity of roles in succession. And we also have the problems of the emotional involvement with problems in the business, which in fact, we might address in the second part of our discussion, which is on governance. Have you got anything else to say on those?
Well, no, we can discuss. I'm going through some of the questions that are there, but they can be well handled in the context of governance. So just one clarification. Once again, there is one, Silvia Gonzalez, who is asking, do you mean having a strategy, knowing who will be the successor? This is one of the elements of the strategy. But for instance, we tend to continue to think in terms of individual succession. I mean, there is going to be one successor. It is not necessarily what is going to happen, especially with the millennials generation, or even more with the Z generation in the future, because they are more skeptical about the idea of one man in command or one woman in command, one human being in command. They tend to have more models of sharing responsibilities, and that immediately recalls us the idea of governance. How do you prepare the business and persons for collective management rather than individual top management positions?
Right. I think what I would like to do, because several of you have raised issues which I think, are very important issues and directly relate to governance. And I also can say that some of you raised issues which hopefully I will address next week in terms of how do we select and develop successors from the talent pool. But in terms of governance now, which I think addresses a lot of the issues that some of you've raised, and I think if we discuss this governance issue with Salvo right now, and at the end of that, I think then we can have more of an open discussion and take back some of these questions you've raised and collect the two things together, strategy and governance and the context and so on. So if I move on to governance then, Salvo, in an earlier conversation that you and I have had, one of the profound comments that you've made, which have made me smile, is that you've referred to the dark side of family business, which makes me think of Darth Vader and so on. But what do you mean by this term of the dark side, and how does governance help solve the issues with regard to relationships and clarities of role and so on that we've had in the questions?
Well, I refer to the dark side of family businesses simply because the family side is the less addressed side in the discussion in some family businesses. It's easier to speak about the business. It's more difficult to speak about family issues, especially in when you have large and extended families. And one of the reasons is that whereas the business is hierarchical in its nature, an enlarged business is not. An enlarged business is a sort of federation of sovereignties. Each nuclear family is a sort of a reign. Probably up to a certain moment of its life, it has a sort of hierarchical structures, with the parents being at the top and the children being at the bottom of this hierarchical structure. But this is the maximum level of structure you accept in a family. Once you get married and you build your own nuclear family, you will not accept intrusions in your family. And then the point becomes that when you have a family in business with multiple nuclear families, with multiple branches, etc., find a way to align values and behaviors to those values, to have a common view and a common goal and a common way of intending and designing and thinking of the relationship between the family and the business implies that you accept some limitation to your nuclear family sovereignty. You need to accept that some of the rules you have to apply are at the service of something which is bigger than the interest or the perspective of your nuclear family. But this is not for free. I mean, if you think about the effort that the top management of listed companies do in handling the relationship with their shareholders. 3 or 4 years ago, I was having a conversation with the CEO of a bank that was raising a huge increase of their equity, and they were going to the market for that increase. That was a listed company, and they needed to make a big deal in that respect. And he was traveling every single week in a different continent to meet investors, to meet the financial community, to explain them the plan of their business, etc. And that was to justify to the eyes of those investors the reason why they should invest in that business. With the family, we frequently forget about the importance of the fact that we are not managing, after the first generation, when you could say eventually, here I am managing my own wealth, my own equity. And starting from the second generation, when you have multiple family members who have invested their money in the business, even though that has been inherited, but they could have inherited cash instead of shares. And you as a manager need to be respectful of those investors, because you wouldn't have your job if they hadn't let you do that job. So it's important that you build a structure in which you educate family members, in which you offer information to family members, in which you offer voice to family members, and in the proper moment you ask for vote to family members. And it is also important that you educate family members to understand what is the difference between having right to information, having right to be listened to your voice, and having right for vote. If you don't educate family members to that, they will be confused and they will ask for vote on something they should be simply informed, or vice versa. So the structure of a good governance structure, independent from the laws, the specific law of the country. We know that different countries have different laws that allows different structures, etc. But whatever the legal structure of governance should be facilitated by the governance structure is that the family is intended as a communitas of people, as a community of people with family members which are united and committed to the family business. And I will be back on this respect about what united I mean by united, who intend the transfer of ownership as a responsibility, as a privilege, but also as a responsibility towards the business itself, its stakeholders other than family members and the subsequent generations. And they intend power as service more than as a stage for their brilliant personality, to say. And to get that, you need to create structures that facilitate a positive interaction between those four variables you find at the right side of the slide. It's a mix of knowledge, will, trust and confidence, and love that creates the condition for family members performing what I call good acts of freedom that forge this unity and commitment. Unity doesn't mean conformism. Unity doesn't mean that you cannot disagree, doesn't mean that you cannot even have conflicts. But it means that you handle those conflicts properly and address those conflicts in the proper side, with the proper means, with the proper language and the proper attitude to overcome the problem and not to be, how to say, blocked, paralyzed in the conflict itself.
My mind goes back to a previous webinar that we had when Colin spoke about governance, and he talked about the 4 rooms. But in the past, you in a conversation, you refers to 2 rooms of the boardroom and the bedroom. What do you mean by that?
This comes from a colleague from Argentina who used to say that whereas a non-family business has the boardroom, which is the most important room, in a family business, you have at least 2 rooms, which are the boardroom and the bedroom. And a number of decisions are strongly influenced from what happens in the bedroom. Then if you think about an extended family and you think about how many bedrooms you can have there, I find it very important. I think it is very important that you find a way to connect those bedrooms in a common dialogue rather than having separated discussions in any of those rooms to then bring the result of those discussions to the boardroom. So you need to find a way to align family members to have those issues come up, emerge in a common room, in a common place.
Yeah, so you're saying that we cannot overinvest in good communication within the family. And I think one of the other earlier questions is relevant about roles. So in the governance role, we'll know who has a voice and who has a vote, but everybody's
Yes.
opinion is welcome. So I think that's really important. Now we've had one question that's come up on my screen, which I think we need to look at in a minute, the difference between governance and strategy. But if I keep on this in a minute in terms of governance, point of succession. Why do you think it is at succession that, bearing in mind that you've said about the strategic context, right, for the business, bearing in mind you've talked about governance structures and how important they are, but it seems even without these contexts, everything's okay. And you've referred to this poor gentleman who died suddenly, is in fact, we don't know how long, many days we have, but why do you think at the point of succession, we have this crisis and we have so many businesses fail?
But in some cases, this is because of ignorance, like the case I was mentioning from Myanmar. That is a typical case of ignorance, unawareness. These family members are not prepared to handle the business after the founder. Even though some of them has been working in the business for years, they're not prepared for the leadership of that business. And you need to accurately prepare for the succession at the 3 levels. You have to be prepared for succession at the business level, but you also have to prepare with care succession at the family level to make the family be participating in the proper moment to the process of choosing, preparing, and raising the successor or the successors, and also to be prepared for having sound discussions once succession has happened. And you have not to forget that the ownership structure will also influence the way that the business will succeed or not in the future. So this is one of the reasons, in my opinion. Another point is a number of situations deteriorate from what can be considered a sort of a cognitive conflict, which is conflict on goals or on processes to reach the goals, into relational conflicts. And they become relational conflicts, in my opinion, when those goal conflicts or process conflicts are not properly addressed for a long time. Then, in the context of family businesses, at least. So the relationship deteriorates, and then it is more difficult to recover from that conflict. And whenever you find the business that the family have those kind of relational conflicts, if they are deep and difficult to solve, you need to find ways for eventually separate, which is painful, but is less painful than letting the family, letting the business suffer for a long time for the consequences of these family, which is not already conflict, it becomes a dispute. And we know a number of stories of tremendous disputes that have had a huge impact on the development of the. And this happens also to very large families and large businesses, but it also happens to smaller families and businesses. And these are, in my opinion, two of the most frequent reasons for failure. And or not accepting the consequences of those conflicts, trying to recover from a situation that are very difficult to recover, or thinking that if the conflict is at the family level, you need to work at the business level. It will not work. You can have the most brilliant business, but unless you decide that you will forget of being a family business and you will lead the business as if it were not belonging to a family, then the family will sooner or later have some revenge in somehow on the business. So I'm seeing that in one of the the questions in the chat, there is that is intended that I think that there should be some balance between individual and business needs in somehow. Well, yes, and I think that you have to add a third dimension, which is the family as a collective entity. You need to understand, you need to know the segments of your family, and you need to understand what are the benefits for those segments to belong to this business. In this respect, there are two fundamental questions I frequently ask with families with which I start working. And one of them is, so what is the reason why one member of the next generation of this family should consider rational to invest his or her wealth in equity in this business? And it is relatively easy to find an answer to this question. Then I raise the second question, and this: what is the reason why, if this business could choose its investors, it will choose this family as its owning family? Which is also important, because you need to be proud as a shareholder of being a shareholder of this business, but at a certain point you need to understand that your business should feel proud of belonging to your family as a business, and that is the perfect balance between the two words.
That's interesting, Salvo, because I've learned a lot when we've had a chat on this in the past, and we've got the two fields. We've got the business side, we've got the family side, and the governance brings it together. And I think one comment that Joe, our colleague from Malta, said in one of our previous webinars is that when the current owner is there, he or she has the respect of the family and can actually pull people together and make decisions. But one day that person will not be there. And so that's why we put governance structures in place, so that we can prevent conflict, and people can know their roles and know where things are going. And that's really insightful. What I'd like to do before we go on to some more questions, which are coming up now, they're really good. Can we put the next self-assessment up then, Naya, please? Right, now this one is a self-assessment on governance itself. Same scoring criteria pertains. You either strongly agree with a statement, which you give it a 4, or you strongly disagree and I give it a 0. And the question is this, really, and it's quite searching. We have established strong and practical governance structures, ensuring segregation of business decisions and family emotions. Roles are clear, and there's open communication and decoupled decision-making for the family issues and business imperatives. Now, I think that one of the 5 questions addresses a lot of the things that some of you have raised. So could you kindly go again to where Naya showed us before?
Yes.
And do your voting on those again, please?
I'm going to share this link in the chat.
Thank you.
Here you go.
Let's see what the scoring on this is then.
Yes, I'm starting the countdown.
Thank you. I presume you're recording all the questions and the comments we've had, Naya, I guess, have you?
Yes, we can scroll back in the chat and find the first questions that have still not been answered.
That's great. That's great. Okay, we can do that shortly then. Yeah.
I can see that we have 16 responses, but there's 50 people in the meeting, so we can wait a bit more.
Well, it's not compulsory. We don't have to vote if we
No,
don't want
of
to.
course not. Let's
But
wait
I mean,
another minute.
the interesting thing about succession planning as a topic, of course, is that it's a very confidential subject, and but I can assure you that this particular scoring is based on, we're not recording or anything. We just got the scoring, and we don't know who's scoring what. So that's important, really.
Peter, you have a comment about the scores from
Yeah.
Petra, I think. Scores may be high as the poll rates 1, strongly disagree, to 5, strongly agree, and not 0 to 4 as previously described. This might explain the unusually
right.
high
Yes.
scores.
Yeah. Well, I can't go behind the motives, but that's a good question, as a politician would say. Let's address that as the first question in the Q&A session, then, shall we?
Yes.
We've got a score of 1 through 5 on this, have we, Naya?
Yes. So
yeah, unfortunately,
the middle answer
just to
is
tell everybody,
3.
we are designing an app and a self-assessment that links to our succession handbook and the shared learning network I'll allude to in the future. But we've used this online tool as a way of doing something right now without having our app, which is currently being developed. So it's not imperfect. It's not perfect. So, but it gives us an indication. That's voting's closed. Okay. So if we look at this, I mean, we're all pretty around the same level, aren't we? So we've got a few things in place, but we've got other things to do. And all I reiterate from both the self-assessments is the fact that what we're trying to do is to say, individually, and in this case, collectively, how much work do we have to get this sorted out? Now, do you want to take some of the questions that we've had? I mean, I've got one question that I know that came on the screen, which I think is somebody, I can't remember the colleague who actually mentioned this, but he says, can you tell the difference between strategy and governance? Can you say that, Salvo, or have you any comments on that?
Yeah, well, strategy is the route, is defining where you want to go and why, how you want to go there, what you will need in terms of resources, both tangible and intangible, to reach your goal, and how long will it take to reach your goal in your plans. Whereas governance is defining the structure of the crew that has to lead and the relationship between those who are on board and those who are controlling from outside, and those who are giving directions or advice from outside, and defining the roles that each one has to have in the journey. So the governance is defining who is going to be in what position in the business, who is going to be in what position in the family, and how are you going to coordinate between the two sides. If you don't do that, the risk is that each family member will interact with the business his or her own way. And I can tell an example of a business I've been working with in Indonesia, where you have a very different governance structure law than in Europe, etc. But the issue there was that the family is pretty large, with more than 50 family members in the subsequent generation. This was a third generation family business, very large. The company was very large, was a multi-business company. And they had used it to give access to some resources of the business from each family member. That was almost controllable in the previous generation, when only 5 or 6 family members were interacting with the business. But then, and for instance, they were used to, as family members, they were used to call one of the secretaries in the business to plan for their private jobs or to have maintenance support in their private houses, etc. So the spouse was calling the husband's secretary or the wife's secretary saying, oh, you know, I need to organize my trip, etc. And later on, secretaries started a bit complaining about the fact that they didn't know whether they had to make their job for the person who they reported in the business or for the family. And during the process, they decided to establish a family office. Then they said, well, you know, family office is frequently intended as something that has to deal with the family investments. So we don't want to do that in the present moment. What we want is a family secretariat. And they put a structure to assist family members in their private issues. And they charged family members for the service. They accepted to receive a charge for that. They were paying for the services. They were paying for whatever, but it was clarified the non-interference of family members with the business while preserving a benefit for family members who were not working in the business in their relationship with the family business. So it's all about, it's an example of how do you establish the proper room for family issues and for business issues in the context of a large family business. And you have to understand that even though you don't necessarily reach those very large numbers, things are not less complicated when you have 4 family members with their own nuclear families and their descendants. If you multiply by 3, that number in a couple of generations, you reach large numbers. So the governance is the structure that describes how you are going to handle the relationship between family members on the one side, business issues on the other side, and the coordination between the two.
That's great. I mean, I'm before we can take other questions, but somebody has mentioned, which I think is an interesting topic, and it's something that I'm going to discuss next week in my presentation, which is the danger of nepotism and people being in roles beyond their capability, and how does one avoid that? I mean, the bottom line is that they're family members, and so there are expectations with regard to inheritance and in wealth, and there's expectation with regard to position. But how does one avoid, and I know I'll be covering this next week in terms of selecting and developing successors, but how would you say, in the context of good strategy and governance, how do we address that topic of nepotism?
I think that governance and strategy.
One of the 7 sorry, Salvo. Excuse me.
No, please.
I remember Gandhi said one of the 7 deadly sins is wealth without work. So
yeah, in fact. And what I would say is that having a strategy which also makes clear what are the resources, and competence is a clear resource. Competence is a basic resource to reach your goal. And you have a governance structure in the family where you have a forum for discussion, where you have a forum for education. It is easier that faulty nepotism is defeated. Because I go back to the idea of ignorance. You were inviting me to express before. The reason why you get driven by blind nepotism is ignorance and unawareness about the consequences of that blind nepotism. Because if you are sufficiently educated to understand the consequences of your action, you will understand what the consequences, even for your nephew, will be the negative consequences of blind nepotism. And if you, as the as the involved person are individually unable to see those aspects, the fact of being in a room where other people will raise their voice, will express their opinion, will invite you to consider things from a different perspective. And at the very end, it will not be your individual decisions, but there will be a vote, will help in reducing the risk of that blind nepotism.
I'd like to
The
open
main
this up
risk,
to...
in my opinion, is not involving family members, is not making family members professionals in their relationship with the business. And the primary responsibility of a family governance structure is to make each family member a professional, aware family business owner, first of all.
And I'll just say this before we go on to other questions, that I think that, well, others have said that leadership cannot be taught, but it can be learnt. So I think that it's nice to create structures for meritocracy within family business. In other words, a person can prove that she or he is capable of doing the job and is given as much support as possible so that she or he can achieve. And I think that if there's a team structure and there's a context of a strategy, then there's every chance that people can see that they need to learn, as we all have to learn. Doesn't matter how old we are, we've still got a lot to learn, and that's good. That's the whole point. Are there any other questions that other people would like us, Salvo, to answer?
Shall I go back and read some of the comments we've had from the
Would you
beginning?
mind, Naya, please? I'm afraid I don't have some of the other ones, so if you could kindly do that.
Okay, so we've had some comments in the beginning from Fedra about the emotional aspect, which is the most difficult issue to handle, as when there is a disagreement, some members might take it personally and cannot see clearly based on valid arguments why we disagree. For instance, effective communication, coordination, and clarity of job roles, comprehending each other's role rather than artificial harmony is key.
Yeah,
Would you like to
I
comment?
absolutely agree. I mean, when I was mentioning unity, I explicitly said that this doesn't mean conformism or artificial harmony. You can align your vision through conflict, but the point is that you need to educate family members to exactly prevent what Fedra was mentioning about taking it on a personal level. But this is something that depends on the way you learn how to communicate in the family. You need to prepare to educate, and this is part of the governance responsibility, to educate family member to properly deal with disagreements, to properly express disagreements, to properly react to disagreements, to properly address confrontation without making it litigation.
I think that's really important, but there is another question that's come up, which I think is really directly relevant to this: the involvement of the third generation, and what happens when you have, we've talked about the boardroom and the bedroom, but you have a third generation family member who has equity stake or maybe even a role in the company, and the husband and wife would want to express their opinion. How do we handle that situation where the person is not directly a shareholder, but is the spouse of a shareholder?
Well, you have to never forget that in addition to being the spouse of a shareholder, this person is also one of the two parents of one of the fourth or more of the fourth generation family members. And this person will have a strong influence on how these next generation family members will think about the family. So the discussion about spouses need to be addressed very consciously, very cautiously, and very thoughtfully in whatever extended family in business. The easier way, and I have invited people to follow that way for years, is to take them apart. It's very easy to think, don't open the family business to in-laws. But then when I started seeing the consequences for the subsequent generation of that closing the door, I started thinking and experiencing different ways of balancing the two aspects. If you ask me, do you suggest an in-law be one of the key managers in the family business? I would say you need to be cautious because of in this respect. You can find good managers in the market without compromising your family relationships in this respect. On the other hand, what I have experienced is that if those in-laws don't feel part of your family, they will transfer that not feeling part of your family to their children. And that will affect their relationship in the future with the other branches of the same family. Last week, I was having a board meeting with a Spanish family in which I sit in the board. This business has been founded by two brothers, and then they put two more brothers on board, and the second generation is already entering the business. Now they were discussing about establishing 4 holdings for having each branch its own holding. And I said, oh, that's great, because you are creating a structure in the group, but you have now to think on how will you attract family members in feeling part not of 4 different companies, but feeling part of one single family business. There are, in the relationship between a family and a business, there are both centripetal forces and centrifugal forces. And it's a matter of magnetism. You need to find the good balance between centrifugal force and centripetal forces. Because if centripetal forces takes the lead in somehow, you will have implosion. If centrifugal forces will take the lead, you will have explosion. Now, you need to find the proper balance. It's like the solar system. The planets stay in their own routes because they have the proper balance with the sun. If the gravity force of the sun would take the lead, then all the planets will fall down in the sun, and then the solar system would not exist anymore. But the opposite could happen if the centrifugal forces would take the lead. And centrifugal forces are whatever distracts family members from their interest with and for the business. And you need to, and if family members lost interest in their relationship with the business, sooner or later the business will not exist anymore. Or the best thing they can do in a certain moment will be to sell the business, because no business can survive for time without committed shareholders.
Yeah, I mean, I've had a situation once when I met a owner of a family business, and he said he was going to divide his business 20% to each of his 5 children. And I said, and I've only just met him, I said, that's really great. How many of them work in the business? 2 of them. How many of them are competent? Well, 1 is really competent. And I said, well, how then are we going to design a structure in the future for driving the business forward? So this is a very interesting subject because we're talking about governance, but in the involvement of in-laws, I think that's really deep things that you've said in terms of they're bringing up and influencing the next generation. So they need to be involved. They need to have a voice, but they don't need to have a vote. Is there anybody else who would like to ask Salvo a question now, or can we take another one from Niles? Does anybody want to speak at the moment about asking a question? Well, that's an overwhelming situation. Don't all speak at once. Can we have a look at the questions that we've got on the chat, Naya? Have we got another one there?
Yeah, we have some comments. One comment was about strategy.
Maybe Peter, not some of the participants, but some of our partners could eventually say something if they want.
Absolutely.
I'd be happy to have some contribution from some other partner of our consortium.
There is a new comment actually now. What about the opposite? Members who do not want to develop a career in the company business want to be part of it somehow?
That's a good question, isn't it? It's a very good question. Because I mean, there is a situation, Salvo, I've had where children have told me that they won't tell their dad they don't want to work in the business because they might be disinherited, but when he's dead, they want to leave the business and sell their shares. So what can we do about children who want to have a career outside the business?
Well, you have the right to develop. I think that each family member has the right to develop his or her career wherever he or she wants. And the point is to be educated, to differentiate between being a shareholder and being a manager in the business. Obviously, you need to be realistic and to try to understand what is the benefit for that specific family member of being a shareholder without being involved in the business. Will the business create enough wealth to repart dividends in that case? Being shareholders entitles you to some benefits. Otherwise, once again, I repeat, you will lose interest in the business. But parts of the responsibility of the parents is to take the responsibility to prepare for governability, the future of the family business, and to create enough wealth in the family to be in a situation that the business is not going to be the only asset you can make your successors inherit. Because sometimes that comes from the fact that, there can be two perspectives in this respect. One of them is that parents want to make their children share whatever asset, which is faulty. I mean, and once again, you need to make these people foresee what are the consequences of this. One example I frequently do to parents who say, oh, I want my children have just, I simplify, if they have 2 kids, I want each one of my 2 kids have 50% of whatever I hold. Then let us imagine you have a framework by a very relevant painter. Would you split the paint in 2? You're leaving them no value. And that happens also in certain cases with shares. So you need to ask, does it make sense to go in that direction? What is the reason why? And then you need to create, let's suppose that you are giving shares to one family member or multiple family members. Having multiple family members owning shares without working in the family business is quite common in a lot of large family businesses. In large family business, large multinational family businesses, or even in multi-generational small family businesses, it's quite frequent to have multiple shareholders not working in the business. The most important point in this case is to clarify what are the expectations. What do you expect by being shareholders of this business? And then to try to understand and make them clarify whether being shareholders of this business can fulfill their expectations or not without compromising the sustainability of the business per se.
Can I add something?
By all means,
Certainly.
carry on, Keith.
So my feeling is I'm second generation. My feeling is that the first generation is the gutsy business person who takes on the business with the priority being the business. Further on, when there are children involved, this strong decision making starts becoming diluted with the emotions. We discussed this briefly in one of the previous talks. The problem is that any good business leader would not necessarily bank on his emotions to make decisions. This is, there needs to be a balance. It's not easy. I understand it's not easy, but the survival of the business depends on the business decision making and not the emotional decision making. Because I'm pretty sure that, and most probably you guys are the experts, you have seen this in the past years. If the business is not run with a business mind, but with an emotional mind, that business is at risk. I think just like the first generation would have taken the plunge and set up a business with all its risks, need to pass that on. So the business torch, more than the emotional torch, needs to be passed on, because it's a business after all. It's not a family gathering. So decision making should be banked on business priority, giving a fair share to the emotion. But I don't think that it should be 50-50. I think it's risking, because emotions, there are different individuals, different upbringings, different backgrounds, different baggage. It becomes very risky. I too have children now, and I hope that when I have to pass it on, I will stick to the business decisions and not the emotional ones, because the emotional ones are not the ones which built the business in the first place. Thank you.
Thanks, Keith. Do you want to comment on that, Salvo?
I see Rania is in the room, and she's really an expert on emotions in family business. So Rania, may I invite you to express your perspective on this?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks, Keith. Thank you, Salvo, for putting this out. Thank you for this very interesting observation and question. Actually, you know, what characterizes family businesses from other organizations is this emotional component, partly. And that's what can be a strength for the family business if we know how to manage it properly. You were saying that, you know, when business decisions are, you know, being taken with an emotional mindset, maybe the decisions, you know, will not be optimal for the family business. But actually, if we don't take into account those emotions, those business decisions might be, you know, good on the short run, but in the long run, they might, you know, lead to family rivalry, family conflicts, and perhaps not make the business sustainable. So I'll give you, you know, two examples to let you know about this. For example, the decision of selling one of the business entities. If we do not take into account as family members the emotional attachment of, for instance, the previous generation to the core business when making this decision, we can sell the business, you know, and make perhaps, you know, some interesting, profits out of the sale. But at the same time, this might lead to conflicts and tensions between the previous generation and the current generation, because the previous generation was very emotionally attached to that business. It was, all about the history of the business. And this may, in a way, dilute, the values of the business and disseminate, this purpose across members, and there will be no aligned vision. So for instance, making the decision to sell a business entity needs to take into account the emotion that some family members might feel regarding those businesses, and to what extent that they will feel regret upon the sale of this decision or not. We have some examples of family members who bought back the business, after their sale because they regretted the sale. In France, where I'm based, the Tétanger champagne business, for example, family members bought it back after the sale. And we have also other examples, like if you take the Lacoste family who sold the business, some family members were not necessarily very, very happy with the sale, but they tried to, to do something about it later. And we have other examples. So that's one example. Another example of good emotions that we need to take into account, although they're negative, guilt emotions. Sometimes members misbehave in the family business, for example, regarding the environment, regarding social responsibilities, and so on. And if some other family members feel guilty regarding those misbehaviors, they might take actions to compensate for those behaviors and improve the reputation of the business. So taking again into account, guilty feelings might be good for the business on the longer run. All this keeps to say that, it's important to identify and address emotional dimensions while making family business decisions. But finding a balance. You were saying it's maybe not 50-50, not 50% emotions, 50% rational. It's like a dance, it's like a tango dance, I would say. Sometimes you would need to inject more emotions into the decision, sometimes more rationality into the decision. But I would recommend, based on research and practice at least, to always think about which emotions could be involved and how we can deal with them rather than suppressing them.
That's great, Rania.
Thank you, Rania.
That's very good. That's very insightful. I've got a comment here, which I don't want to steal anybody's thunder, but I think it's a very interesting comment. Obviously, you've hit home with regard to the need for governance, but what are the minimum governance structures you could put in for a small business, Salvo? Something that's, if we're not a large company, maybe, I don't know, 5 or 10 people or something, what sort of governance, rather than not having any, what is the basic structure that we could put in?
A forum in the family to foster discussion among family members about their relationship with the business, about their views about the business, and also to be, again, to the last question, to learn how to handle those emotional issues. You can learn how to handle emotionality. You can learn how to handle emotion, how to interact with one another's emotion, etc. And this is, for this is necessary a forum in the business, which is a forum where you do promote discussion, promote education, promote interaction, promote learning on communication and things like that. And a board in the business that create a shared top-level decisions at the business level. And then the two of them interacting from time to time. But if the family is little, you will have the same persons handling different hats in different moments. But learning the discipline of thinking under different hats is helpful in a family business.
But what about a facility? What if you have an extremely strong leader who's quite fearful? And there are a few. And as a result of that, people do not open up in discussion. Is it good to have, what I'm asking, is it good to have a structure, i.e. a regular meeting every quarter or something, and possibly an external facilitator? Or, I mean,
yes, it is, absolutely.
So you think it's
having external facilitators can help a lot in this respect, because it helps in somehow putting some brake for the exuberant owner manager you're speaking about, and it helps also the other family members to express their opinions. And sometimes it can create the conditions to make them express their opinions without fearing about the reaction of the exuberant owner, manager, or founder.
We're having a lot of interesting questions here, and I'm wondering which one to take first. But there's
Yeah, but
we
need to establish what is the moment we are going to an end, because we have to be respectful of the time of people, and we promised that it was until 5.
Okay, in that case, it's right. Okay, so what we can do is we can save these questions for another session.
We can save the questions for the next session. We can eventually even react in written to some of the questions. And I repeat, I don't want to stop the discussion, which is very interesting, but I think that we need to respect the time we promised to people.
Perfectly right. It's a good job you're the chairperson of this event, Salvo.
No.
Because we need one next time. Right, okay. I think that we've created a lot of interest here. I think that it does lead on to our discussion next week. So I'll invite you to our interview, in which case Salvatore is going to interview me, and we're going to be discussing the structures for succession planning as a one-stop approach, and how do we select and develop successors, and how do values guide the business. So I just want to say thank you very much for Salvo for all the work that you've done. Thank you for Naya for hosting it. Thank you for Rania and everybody else who's contributed and given questions. And we are going to create a shared learning network for those of you who wish to follow on from these webinars. And if you're interested, then you can say your interest in Naya. And this shared learning network is to take you through to design your own succession plan. So thank you everybody for joining. And I hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully see you next week.
Thank you.